to take a couple minutes to talk about the idea of inclusion. Somehow, inclusion has become this political and cultural lightning rod, which I don't think is well deserved and really doesn't serve us very well. Because if we slow down and start to look at what the idea here is, what is inclusion? At its simplest level, it's to be included. And inclusion is a necessary first step for belonging. Belonging is an advanced cousin of inclusion. We can't belong if we are not included. And when we look across all of our different social and cultural groups, there's a common thread. People are longing for a sense of inclusion and belonging. People are desperate to be connected, to belong. And sometimes that desperation leads them to places of fear and anxiety and worry, driving their behavior instead of focusing on love and connection and empowerment. Now, why make that polarity? Well, it's a pretty old and historic polarity, the idea of we operate from a basis of fear or we operate from a basis of love. Now, given a choice and a totally blank slate, I think most of us would choose to act from a place of love. But our socialization and even our evolution is so closely connected to survival and using fear as a mechanism to help our species survive that we have this fear bias, right? We have a negativity bias. We lean towards being alert and aware of the things that are dangerous, that might pose a threat, that might somehow be a harm to us. And we know from neuroscience that we experience psychological harm and psychological pain in the same ways that we experience physical pain and physical harm. The same pain center of our brain registers both. The same is true of pleasure. We experience psychological or emotional pleasure in the same place that we experience physical pleasure. In that sense, our brain's wiring is pretty simple. Now, that's probably the only place that I'll say our brain's wiring is simple, but we get this sort of natural, even, we're going to put that in quotation marks, separation of our bodies respond to fear and our bodies respond to love in different ways. Evolutionarily, the fear part of our brain is much older. Sometimes you hear people talk about our reptilian brain, right? And our pleasure sensor exists in our prefrontal cortex, the mammalian brain, the brain that is the basis for our warmth and connection to other mammals, to other humans. And there are powerful biological, neurobiological forces at work here. And I don't think for a moment that anyone wants to be excluded. In fact, I think some of this opposition to inclusion is the feeling of exclusion in disguise. People are feeling excluded. And so they look at this term inclusion and say that doesn't mean inclusion, that means exclusion. Because that's the thing that I'm feeling. I haven't voiced it, and I maybe haven't articulated a way that I'm not feeling included. There's something about this that I feel like I'm left out of, and that hurts. It hurts in the same part of our brain that it hurts when we fall and scuff our knee or break a bone. It hurts to be excluded. We are wired as social creatures to feel that rejection in powerful ways. Because being rejected, being isolated, being excluded from a group in the early days of humans would mean death. And so it's no real surprise that psychologically and emotionally we experience it in that same way. But I want us to take a step back from this idea of inclusion as a political cudgel, as a weapon to use against someone somehow, and just consider it from its most basic elements. We all want inclusion. We all want to be connected and included. And I actually think that part of the reason people are so frustrated these days with the division we experience socially and politically is because it flies in the face of this primal drive to be connected and included. Because of that cousin of inclusion, we want to belong. Belonging to a family, belonging to a community, belonging to a group or a team is deeply meaningful, sometimes on levels that we can't even really quite describe. The best of our social groups come from when we look for ways to help other people feel and know that they belong, right? Because I look across all of this social violence happening around the idea of inclusion, and let's not kid ourselves, it's incredibly violent. It's disturbing how violent it is. People are taking to space to say, I'm going to punish you for advocating for this idea that we should include people. I mean, it's hard to even grasp at some level, and yet it's not, right? If we even just step back to our neurobiology, it's not that surprising. But we're not predetermined by that. We don't have to commit and say, this is the only way we can and will be. We can do a different thing. And that's why I want us to consciously, thoughtfully come back to inclusion and even take a stand, right? There's a wild idea. Take a stand for inclusion. It's essential. It is essential for our connection to each other. It's essential for our love of everyone we have around us. And I feel very comfortable challenging you to look to a space in your life where you feel the most warmth and love, and tell me that that is not based on the idea that you are included and that you belong. And if you flip that around, the places where we feel the most pain are those places where we don't feel like we belong. And sometimes we don't feel like we belong because other people haven't opened the doors and welcomed us in. They may or may not actually be trying to exclude us, but I know lots of shy, socially awkward folks that don't quite know how to say hi to the new face. And sometimes it's not that they're upset that you're there, it's that they don't quite know how to connect and include you in that first step. Because here's what I've seen. I've been in lots of spaces. I've been in academic spaces, I've been in healthcare, I've been in professional and corporate spaces. I've sat with people across an entire spectrum of politics. And I do not think at the core that any of those people truly want anything else than a really basic self-need of being included and finding spaces and places where they belong. And that's in our power, right? We have the power to include people because at its most basic level, inclusion is a choice. Consciously or not, we choose to include people, and when we don't choose to include people, by default, we are excluding them. Part of that is because that's the experience that the other person is having. We may not mean to exclude them, but that's what's happening. Look across our divisions. And it's not necessarily that someone's saying you can't be part of this. They're saying, if you want to be part of this is our expectation of you, which is a bit hard to argue. It's not unreasonable to set boundaries and expectations for our relationships with others. In fact, that's where our relationships thrive the most, is when we have clear boundaries and expectations. But when we don't choose to actively include people, the default outcome is a feeling of exclusion. And I see that everywhere. I think that the pain of exclusion is what is driving a large part of this cultural violence around the idea of inclusion. And I know there's other pieces that we could go to. We could go to talk about diversity, and we could go to talk about equity, but I don't think we need to. Not that those aren't important. I think in some ways, those up the ante. And yeah, I think it would be great to tackle those and chat about those and start to unwind those concepts for ourselves and find more common ground, because I think there's more common ground to be had. But it starts with inclusion. We have to choose to include other people, and we have to recognize the ways that we may be unintentionally excluding. Now, I'm going to make a carve out to this. I'm going to borrow from Dr. Tim Clark, who created the 4 stages of psychological safety. It's a brilliant model. I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge fan of Dr. Clark. I'm a huge fan of his work and his model. And he offers the idea that we owe people inclusion at a very basic level. He offers the idea that we owe other people inclusion just for being human beings, with the carve out, unless you pose a threat. Now, when I talk to folks about this, there's always the common question that comes up. What kind of threat do we mean? Do we mean physical? Do we mean psychological? I think yes, right? People who pose a physical threat, there's a real and rational and reasonable purpose for not including them, or including them with limits. Sometimes people pose psychological threats because they're actively threatening. Sometimes we feel that they're threatening and experience that as a psychological threat. I think that space is much murkier. But I also think that focusing there misses where most people are, right? Let's say there's that bell curve and we've got the physically dangerous and the psychologically dangerous. And I think that those are out at the extremes of the curve, right? Very small numbers. And if we can hold for a moment a need to nail down that definition, we can create a space where we actually include everyone else right out of the gates. And what changes? What changes when we're included? When we're part of something, when we feel like we belong, we can access more of that love center in our lives and that love approach to our lives, and not this fear place, right? Inclusion does not and cannot live in this place of fear. Even inclusion based around fear is ultimately nothing but exclusion. You think throughout history, leaders who have used fear to motivate a group to be a consolidated, focused group, to include and create a sense of belonging based around fear, has always led to horrible outcomes. Death, discrimination, all manners of violence, right? We know where fear gets us. We're not ignorant to that. It's just hard to manage or navigate that wiring sometimes. I get that. But it comes back to this. Inclusion is a choice. And I want to challenge anyone who feels stuck on this idea to just pause with it for a minute, to say, if I think of you at a fundamental level as deserving inclusion as a human being, what change does that make in the way I think about you? If I think about you as just at a fundamental level, wanting to be included and to belong, how might I see you differently? How might I see behavior that I think is really problematic and alarming? And I would say disconcerting, but that's how do I think about the behaviors I see you doing that I don't like? Now, lean into that. There's a good chance that you're projecting something that you're doing that you don't like, that you see in them. And they may be doing a worse version of the thing you're doing, but your responsiveness to their behavior may actually point to something you're doing too. And I'll take this on the chin. I will take the idea that I'm being too expansive and too inclusive of people who don't deserve to be included. Because you know what? I am choosing to exclude those edge markers on that bell curve and focus first on these folks in the middle. Because there's lots of people I don't have agreement with socially, politically, culturally. I don't value the same things they do, and I don't value things they value in the same way. But that does not mean I need to exclude them. It does not mean that I can't offer them some base level of inclusion and recognize how powerful and important it is that we move first to include instead of first to exclude. Because I can build relationship with them. And you know what? The only chance I'm ever going to have to influence and shape how they think, or have them help me think differently and see the world in a bigger way, is to actually engage them. It drives people around me bonkers because they think that I'm being friendly or siding with the enemy. And it's not that at all. It's that I've chosen not to see this as a framing of you are my enemy, you are my excluded other. I think the connective tissue is there. Again, it's most easily there for us within those 2 standard deviations. We just have to decide that we want what we get from acting to include folks more than we get from the false sense of security from excluding folks. And lean into the word inclusion. It's powerful. It's almost magical. I can't think of an experience in my life that wouldn't have been enhanced even more by a stronger sense of inclusion and belonging. There's not a relationship I have that I wouldn't like or wouldn't benefit from a stronger sense of belonging. And so why cast this net to be small and only inclusive of the smallest number of people? Include as many people as you can. You may focus your energy on a small number, but there's no reason to actively exclude. And so reclaim this idea of inclusion, right? That's the core challenge here. Don't let it mean exclusion. Don't let it be a masked version of pushing people away, because I don't think it's meant to be. I hear the criticisms that inclusion is somehow divisive, and I think no small part of that is projection. People are not feeling included, or they don't want to include those other people. And so when the idea or the word of inclusion pops up, they turn it around and say, those people don't want to include me. I don't think that's true. Anyway, a couple thoughts from me. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm always open for questions, critiques, a different way to see what and how I'm thinking about this. Because I'm not done here. This isn't the end of my journey in making sense of inclusion and how I can be more inclusive. And I hope it's not the end for you either.